Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about Prelude to Bruise by Saeed Jones. So we're finally back into some poetry, and this was some excellent poetry to get back into. This is such a beautiful collection, and Saeed Jones, after reading this, is a writer I am really excited about. Prelude to Bruise came out in 2014, I think. It was his first full-length poetry collection. More recently, he has a memoir out called How We Fight for Our Lives that I would love to read. I don't have a copy of it at the moment, but I plan to get one. And for both this book, his memoir, a chapbook that he wrote before this, I mean, he's been critically acclaimed, he's won a lot of awards, he is certainly an important voice of the moment, in my opinion. He's also a pretty good Twitter follow. I do have the slightest connection to him in that he went to Western Kentucky University for his undergrad, and that's where I did my MFA. Very, very slight connection, but enough to make you think, oh yeah, I've been where that person has been. Yeah, this is an excellent poetry collection. It does so much in so little space. It addresses a lot of these political and family themes. There are these intersections of sexuality and race. It certainly all feels very seamless, and there is a kind of storytelling element to this poetry collection that makes me very interested to see a memoir. I think you kind of get some hints of that in this. But there's all this beautiful musing on life as an outsider and the experiences of grief and loneliness and exploring sexuality. And it's all conveyed in really beautiful language, imagery, these really fully realized metaphors, and this kind of moody, raw aesthetic that is very appealing to me. So the collection is broken down into 6 sections, and I'll be using that as my guide through this video. But before I get into the sections, I want to talk about the epigraph chosen for the book, which is a Kafka quote: "The man in ecstasy and the man drowning both throw up their arms." Having finished the collection, going back and reading the epigraph again, it is really such a perfect fit for these poems. Ecstasy, drowning. We see struggle and hardship and pain and grief throughout. And we also see love and intimacy, and those things often coinciding. And the word drowning in that quote feels really important after reading the collection because water imagery is reoccurring throughout. You know, there's lots of swimming kind of imagery, and the idea of drowning comes up more than once. You can see that there's like swimming in a river on the cover, so that's clearly very important theme throughout that captured the writer for sure. So there is one opening poem that kind of sets the tone for the collection, and then we get into the first section, which focuses on the speaker's boyhood experiences. And a lot of the poems have the word boy in the title, and boy becomes kind of the third-person version of the narrator that reoccurs throughout the collection. So in these early poems, while the speaker is still in his family's home, we see a lot of these family dynamics play out. We see, you know, a loving mother that there is some, you know, connection to in those themes. And then we see a more complicated relationship with the father. These poems depict a queer story, and that is a main source of conflict between the speaker and his father, is that he pushes back against these traditional gender roles. And that's clearly not what the father wants in his son, and there's this judgment and shame and all of this internalized guilt coming from that parent. So we're seeing throughout this collection the speaker exploring their sexual identity, much like any young person would at that age, but they're exploring a queer identity, and the father brings conflict into that, of course. And we also see these external sources. This is a rural community in the South, so we're establishing this outsider feel from the speaker and how difficult it is for them to reckon with these things that feel very natural and normal, and the very harmful reactions that the people in the speaker's life are having to him. Like, there's this interest the boy has in like the female figure and female clothing and the kind of performance of that. You know, there's a poem that talks about, you know, dressing in drag and things like that. And then in this section, there's a part where the dad says something like sissy clothes, and he's burning these women's clothes that the boy has been hiding. So there's some really painful scenes in those early poems in this section. And, you know, as with everyone, those childhood moments shape what comes next. So from a more craft perspective, there are tons and tons of really beautiful metaphors, and they are fully realized in that they're carried throughout a poem. There's the initial metaphor, and then it kind of gets broken down every way that you could to expand upon it and make it more complicated. So we end up with this really beautiful language. There's also an awareness of sound throughout, which is something as a writer of poetry maybe I notice more, but the little internal rhymes and the alliterations and those things that make the poems sound good, even beyond the actual content of the poems. And then there's lots of really interesting structural and grammar choices. Pretty early, there's a poem called The Blue Dress that is kind of one long run-on sentence. It's like a list structure with a lot of really beautiful imagery, water-based, as we see over and over again in this collection. There is one very short poem from this section that I wanted to read that I think is important thematically. It's called Boy at Threshold. The front door kicked open to a sky of wind-blown herons, pewter wings bent back by dark gust. If I were your blood, I would fear this feathered dusk, but I've always wanted to be dangerous. The air grabs my lapel, rough-tongued gale, and drags me free. So that poem makes me feel like everything happening in this first section is a beginning, a jumping off point, the backstory to a character who feels like their life's beginning. I've always wanted to be dangerous, and then almost like you don't even choose it, but you were meant to do it, you're dragged out into the world. So that kind of feels like the note that we end section 1 on. And then we go into section 2. The character feels a little bit older. They seem to be moving out into the world more, and we see more themes about race as a Black man writing these poems come into the speaker's worldview. And we also see the sexual relationships and the intimate relationships developing. We see a lot of violent language along with those relationships. We see people dealing with their own shame about who they are. A lot of that seems very painful. I think we get the first hints in this section of self-medicating with like alcohol. That becomes a greater theme as we go on throughout the collection. One poem in this section that I want to talk about, I'm not going to read in its entirety, but I would like to discuss it, is Jasper, 1998. So this poem is written in memory of James Byrd Jr., who, if you don't know, was the Black man who was dragged behind a vehicle in Texas. Absolute horrible, racially motivated lynching. And it's truly a horrific moment. It's something that's difficult to look at, and I imagine would be a really difficult thing to write about. And I think Saeed Jones pulls it off with such grace and emotional intensity, and the effect is incredible in this poem. It's certainly a standout for me in the entire collection. And we're really seeing everything from James Byrd Jr.'s perspective. It's very internal inside of his head. There's this horrible terror to it all. Oh, I don't even feel I can do this poem complete justice, so you're just gonna have to get the book and read that one for yourself. So moving into section 3, I think there's even more of a focus on the intimacy in these relationships with unnamed men. I think we're really seeing this sense of escapism. There's a kind of escapism in these relationships that the speaker is seeking out, maybe escaping from some of those traumas of the past, or, you know, what is the result of trying to face those traumas. And we see some pill abuse happening in this section, which goes hand in hand with those kind of escapism themes and maybe some avoidance of those really painful things in the speaker's life. And then there's also some heartbreak and loneliness in this section, which makes for some really beautiful poetry, definitely work that feels emotionally resonant, and I imagine would for any reader. So there's one poem close to the end of this section that I wanted to read called Prelude, which comes from a Nina Simone song. So I'll read that now. Last night the ceiling above me ached with dance. Music dripped down the walls like rain in an old house. My eyes followed the couple's steps from one corner to the other, pictured the press of two chests against soft breathing, bodies slipping in and out of candlelight. The hurt was exquisite. In my empty bed, I dreamed the record's needle pointed into my back, spinning me into no one's song. So that is a really beautiful, lonely song. The structure of it, it's written in couplets, which is really fitting, you know, a couple dancing above you, and then the kind of rhythmic feel of couplets. You know, this is sort of a musical poem. But, you know, I love some of the images in this, like the music drip down the walls like rain in an old house. So, section 4 is a lot about grief, and this is one that really hit me, really grabbed me emotionally in a way that not all poetry does if I'm kind of staying in that intellectual space while I read it, but this had me really emotional reading some of these poems. It's really heartbreaking, and this is the section where we see that drowning imagery and that drowning metaphor come to the forefront of the poetry. So we see first the loss of this loving mother, and there are a couple of these kind of ghostly poems about her. And then what really got to me somehow was this poem about the loss of the father, which is called Casket Sharp, and happens at the father's funeral. It actually made me cry, this poem. And there's just something so raw about it, and it's not just grief at the loss of a father. There's this whole complicated history between the father and the son, and there's so much they didn't get to have in that relationship because of the father's prejudices. And we get the start of this idea that comes up later in some of the poems, and I'll talk about it more then, of the similarities between the father and the son, or this other self within the son that's a reflection of the father, and it's kind of this painful seed within the speaker. So that hit really hard. After that poem, I had to take an extended break from the collection for a little while, because I just, it I don't know. And then, we see the speaker in this really, really dark place. You kind of get pulled into it in the poems, and you see this suicidal ideation and kind of a rock bottom moment happening in section 4. But right at the end in the last poem, there's this kind of hint of starting again or rebirth, like a little bit of hope moving out of that. So section 5 is one long poem called History According to Boy. So this section kind of takes us back to those boyhood moments. It's a more narrative kind of poetry. So we get a bit of storytelling. We really see the timeline of the major events in Boy's life. And it fills in some of the gaps, some of the history, and adds some context to the rest of the poems. We really see this feeling of being on the outskirts of the society that you grow up in. This is a boy who is struggling with their sexual identity, especially, dealing with homophobia, not only from kids at school, but at home with their father. And we also see those themes intersecting with race. The boy has their first explorations with, chatting online and trying to talk to men online, and finds that if they pose as a white boy, they get much more positive responses than with their own pictures. So we're seeing all those things intersect. We're seeing the context of that life. And we're also really getting a glimpse into this father-son dynamic, and it is an abusive one. And the abuse is, of course, directly connected to sexual identity, and we see how that forms this trauma and shame in the speaker. And that's when we get this idea of the son having this piece of his father within him that is rageful and shameful, and that seems to be really the emotional core, the hurdle that the speaker has to reckon with and deal with in order to live their life. And then section 6, which is just a single poem called Last Portrait as Boy. And I want to point out the last 2 lines of this poem, which are, I am not a boy, I am not your boy, I am not. And those words end this entire collection, where we've been looking at boy and exploring this boy as a character throughout, and we've been dealing with this father who is not accepting of his son and has left him with all of these internal struggles. And we're really seeing this whole collection, the speakers trying to grapple with that past that has formed him, but he doesn't want it to hold him back. And I feel like the way it ends, that feels like moving forward. That feels like letting go as much as you can, and the freedom in that. So this whole collection felt hugely emotionally resonant. It felt very raw. It felt important. This collection takes a hard look at the past and addresses it in this rich, beautiful language. And every emotional climax in this collection feels very earned. It's not a poetry collection that I think would be best experienced as individual poems. I think the build throughout each poem is what makes something like Casket Sharp hit you so hard. It's so hard to write about things like that, to write about death and to write funeral poems and make it feel fresh and like you're not saying things that have been said a million times. And I mean, that's certainly not an accusation you could give to this book. It's so good and so impressive from like a writerly standpoint. So I really would like to get my hands on that memoir now. It's been really nice to read some poetry again. You know, I was reading the Dune series for a long time and hadn't read some poetry. It's definitely inspiring me to write a bit more. But then at the same time, it's that, oh, well, nothing I write is this good, so what's the point? Anyways, the next book I will be reading will be On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, which I have really been looking forward to getting into. Yeah, I think that's all I have for this video. Read this. This is great poetry. This is poetry that I think non-poetry readers could appreciate. Highly recommend, and follow Saeed Jones on Twitter. He's a really good Twitter follow too. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.